The old Victorian house on Maple Street stood like a sentinel of forgotten eras, its gabled roof sagging under the weight of time, its weathered clapboards peeling like the skin of some ancient beast. The air inside was heavy with the scent of aged wood and dust, a testament to the years it had endured, watching families come and go, their joys and sorrows seeping into its walls. Thomas Hargrove, a man in his late 30s whose broad shoulders seemed to carry more than just the physical weight of his labor, stood in the foyer, his calloused hand resting on the chipped brass doorknob. He had just opened the door to let in the new maid, a woman named Margaret, according to the agency's curt email. She stepped inside, her movements tentative, her face partially obscured by a frayed wool scarf despite the mild September afternoon. Her eyes, a sharp green that seemed to pierce through the dim light, darted nervously around the room, as if she sensed the house itself was watching her. "Daddy, she's the woman who left me to die." The voice that shattered the quiet was shrill, raw, and unmistakably Daniel's. Thomas's 12-year-old son stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his small frame rigid with a fury that seemed too big for his body. His dark hair fell into his eyes, which burned with an intensity that made Thomas's heart lurch. Daniel's fists were clenched, his knuckles white, and his chest heaved as if he'd just run a mile. Thomas froze, his hands still gripping the doorknob, his mind scrambling to process the accusation. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking, and the room seemed to shrink around them, the walls leaning in to listen. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" Thomas's voice was gruff, tempered by years of working in the lumber yard, but there was a tremor beneath it, a father's instinct sensing something deeper in his son's outburst. He turned to Margaret, who stood motionless, her scarf slipping slightly to reveal a face etched with lines of hardship. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes widened, betraying a flicker of something, of fear, perhaps, or guilt. Thomas's gaze flicked back to his son, whose small body trembled with rage, his face pale but for the red flush creeping up his neck. "Explain yourself," Thomas said, his tone sharper now, directed at the woman who had just crossed their threshold. Margaret's hands tightened around the worn leather satchel she carried, her knuckles whitening as if she were clinging to it for stability. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only a faint, unsteady breath. Daniel's glare never wavered, his eyes locked on her as if he could will her to confess with the force of his stare alone. "She's her, Daddy," he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "The one from the fire, the one who ran and left me." The words were a blade, cutting through the silence, and Thomas felt a chill settle into his bones. He knew exactly what Daniel meant, though he prayed his son was wrong. 5 years ago, when Daniel was 7, their lives had been upended by a fire that tore through their old apartment building on the edge of town. Thomas had been working the night shift at the lumberyard, his hands stained with sawdust, his mind on the bills piling up at home. Daniel had been asleep in their third-floor unit when the fire started, a ravenous beast born from faulty wiring in the basement. The flames had spread quickly, swallowing walls and spitting smoke that choked the air. A neighbor, an older man named Mr. Callahan, had braved the inferno to pull Daniel out, finding him curled up in the hallway, half-conscious, his lungs burning with every breath. The boy had survived, but not without scars, both the faint ones on his arms where embers had kissed his skin and the deeper ones in his mind, where the memory of that night had taken root. Daniel had always insisted there was someone else there that night, someone who hadn't helped him. A woman, he'd said, with green eyes and a face he could never forget. She'd seen him, trapped in the hallway, choking on smoke, his small hands clawing at the air as he screamed for help. She'd looked right into his eyes, he claimed, and then she turned and run, disappearing into the chaos, leaving him to the flames. Thomas had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to a child's trauma, the mind playing tricks under the weight of fear. But Daniel had never wavered, not once in 5 years. He'd described her face in vivid detail, of those piercing green eyes, the sharp cheekbones, the way her mouth had twisted as she fled. And now, here she was, standing in their home, her scarf no longer hiding the features Daniel had burned into his memory. "Daniel, you're a kid," Thomas said, his voice softer now, trying to anchor his son's anger. "You were scared. You could be wrong." But even as he spoke, He felt the hollowness of his words. He looked at Margaret, whose face had gone pale as the plaster walls, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Margaret," he said, his tone hardening again, "is this true? Were you there?" Margaret's silence was deafening, a confession in its own right. She took a step back, her gaze darting to the door as if she were calculating the distance to freedom. But Daniel wasn't about to let her slip away again. "You saw me," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, rattling the dusty chandelier above. "I was screaming, and you just ran. You didn't even try to help." His voice broke, and tears spilled down his cheeks, but his anger held him upright, a small warrior facing down a ghost from his past. Thomas felt his heart twist, torn between his son's pain and the woman's palpable fear. He stepped closer to Margaret, his broad frame blocking her path to the door. "Answer him," Thomas demanded, his voice low and unyielding. "Were you there?" Margaret's shoulders sagged, and she sank onto the edge of a faded velvet chair, as if the weight of the past had finally crushed her resolve. Her satchel slipped from her hands, landing with a soft thud on the hardwood floor. "A broken bar I was," she whispered, her voice so faint it barely reached them. "I lived in that building. I was on the 3rd floor, same as you." Her eyes flicked to Daniel, then away, unable to hold his gaze. "The fire was everywhere. The smoke was so thick I could barely see. I heard you screaming, but a broken bar." I panicked. "I didn't know what to do." "You knew I was there." Daniel's voice was a raw, guttural cry, the sound of a wound torn open. "You looked at me, right in my eyes, and you chose to save yourself." His small hands shook, and Thomas reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, but Daniel shrugged it off, his focus locked on Margaret. The room seemed to pulse with his anger, the air thick with the weight of his accusation. Margaret's head bowed, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I was weak," she said, her voice trembling but clear now, as if she'd finally found the courage to speak. "I was terrified. The flames were so close, and the heat of broken bar, it felt like it was burning my skin. I heard you, Daniel, I swear I did, but I thought a broken bar, I thought someone else would get you. There were so many people running, shouting. I didn't think you would be left behind." Her voice cracked, and a tear slipped down her cheek, catching the light. "I've carried that guilt every day since. It's eaten me alive." Thomas's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He wanted to believe her, to see her as a woman caught in a moment of human weakness, but Daniel's pain was a living thing, filling the room with its raw intensity. He looked at his son, whose small chest heaved with the effort of holding back sobs, and then back at Margaret, whose hands trembled as she wiped her face. "Why should we believe you?" he asked, his voice cold. "You come into my home, knowing what you did. You expect us to just let you work here, like nothing happened?" Margaret shook her head, her scarf falling completely now, revealing the full extent of her weary features. Her hair, once a vibrant auburn, was streaked with gray, pulled back in a tight bun that did nothing to soften her gaunt face. "I didn't know it was you," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear it. I saw the ad for this job in the paper. It said day housekeeper needed, Maple Street. I needed the work. I've been drifting, trying to start over. I had no idea this was your house, Daniel. I didn't even know your name until now." Daniel shook his head, his lips curling in disgust. "You're lying," he spat. "You knew. You had to know." His voice was quieter now, but no less fierce, the words laced with the certainty that made Thomas's stomach churn. He wanted to pull his son close, to shield him from this confrontation, but he knew Daniel needed to face it, to let the poison of that night spill out. Thomas turned to Margaret, his eyes narrowing. "You lived in that building," he said, piecing it together. "You were on our floor, and you never came forward, never said a word, even after the fire. You knew a kid almost died, and you just a broken bar disappeared." Margaret's hands flew to her face, covering her mouth as if to hold back a sob. "I was ashamed," she said, her voice muffled. "After I got out, I couldn't face anyone. I moved away, tried to forget, but I couldn't. Every night, I see that hallway, those flames. I hear your screams, Daniel." She looked at him now, her eyes pleading, but Daniel's face was stone, unmoved by her tears. "You don't get to feel bad," Daniel said, his voice low and steady now, the anger giving way to something colder, more resolute. "You don't get to cry about it. You left me to die." The words were a verdict, final and unyielding, and they seemed to drain the air from the room. Margaret flinched, as if struck, and Thomas felt a pang of pity for her, but it was fleeting, overshadowed by his son's pain. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of the house settling around them. Thomas looked at Daniel, whose eyes were still locked on Margaret, and then at the woman herself, who seemed to shrink under the weight of their judgment. He thought of the years since the fire, the nightmares that still woke Daniel in the middle of the night, the way he'd flinch at the smell of smoke or the sight of an open flame. Thomas had tried to rebuild their lives, moving them to this crumbling old house, hoping a fresh start would heal the wounds. But now, the past had walked through their door, uninvited, and it demanded reckoning. "Get out," Thomas said, his voice low and final, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You don't belong here." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the door, his broad frame a silent command. Margaret rose, her movements slow, as if every step was a surrender to the truth. She could no longer outrun. She picked up her satchel, clutching it to her chest like a shield, and paused at the door, looking back at Daniel. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile offering that fell flat in the face of Daniel's unrelenting gaze. She lingered for a moment, as if hoping for something of forgiveness, understanding, anything, but Daniel's silence was her answer. With the final, shuddering breath, she stepped outside, and the door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. Daniel sank to the floor, his legs giving out as the anger drained from him, leaving only the raw ache of memory. His small body curled inward, and the tears he'd held back now fell freely, soaking into the faded rug. Thomas knelt beside him, pulling him close, his own heart heavy with the weight of his son's pain. "She's gone, son," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "She can't hurt you anymore." But as Daniel buried his face in his father's shoulder, his small frame shaking with silent sobs, Thomas knew the truth. The scars of that fire would never fully heal, not as long as Daniel could still see her face, her green eyes staring back at him through the smoke, turning away, running from him in the flames of his nightmares. The house around them seemed to sigh, its walls absorbing this new chapter of their story, another layer of sorrow to carry within its bones. And as Thomas held his son, he wondered if they could ever truly escape the past, or if it would always find a way to walk through their door.